I have no headphones, so let me know if I got feedback.
Eh, I'll see what I can do. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got a chance once again to gather together to discuss the scriptures together, to discuss the work of preaching and its interaction into our congregational relationships. I'm back. Terry's never been anywhere else. We're not quite sure what he does. Um,
Sit
but
here all the time
yeah, he's equally evangelizing and studying consistently and constantly to everyone's satisfaction.
in
He
my
never goes
office.
and does anything else except he magically is also evangelizing right now.
Yeah.
He's doing both.
hmm
Terry, how you doing?
I'm good. It's good to have you back.
Hey, it's good to be back. I think I know what day it is and what time it is. It's questionable. So today we are going to be continuing a dialogue we started a couple weeks ago on the work, role, character, qualification, and appointment of shepherds. It's not necessarily so defined in the outline, but we're certainly going to continue that dialogue. There's some interaction of the text, interaction of experience that we're going to look at. And really, our focus for this conversation today is the character of shepherds, the character of elders. In specific, looking at the text, paying attention to some of the scriptural imperatives, how they interact with one another, some senses of tension or conflict between the two different lists that are found in Titus and in First Timothy, the resolutions to that, maybe some light word studies. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully, we'll get some interaction from folks who are interested and want to kind of participate in the conversation as well, and we'll see what they've got going on there. So let's get down to the heart of the matter and kind of just really get into it and begin to break out each of these passages in sequential order, if you will. Not so much a correlated list, because there's some challenges with that, but also kind of looking at each of these qualities or qualifications as they inch down in each of the passages. A lot of folks, and I'll say this at the get-go, will stay or cite or talk about how a desire for the work is the first qualification. I will say that I have a slightly different answer to that. I think a desire for the work or the lack thereof is actually a first disqualification. And I know that sounds like the same thing, but it's really not. If someone doesn't want to do the work, the how strongly they feel that way is super obvious from the get-go. And so it's kind of a sorting process rather than an actual qualification, disqualification. And I say that because most of the men I know who serve as elders don't necessarily approach the work with this deep thing of, I really, really want to be an elder. Instead, their attitude always seems to be consistent with, I really, really want to serve the congregation in the best ways that I can. And if that's as a shepherd, then that's what I'll do. And that seems similar, but it's really not on a practical level. And so with that kind of set aside, Terry, do you have any comments on that little sideshow,
Well,
if you will, for a second?
I think what's interesting about that is if somebody really, really, really wanted to be an elder, we would probably not appoint him because we think he's power hungry and arrogant.
Right.
Um,
Or just not
and
ready.
yeah,
Um,
and so I think that's one of the issues with that. Um, in fact, I will tell you. So I think I've said this before. I think the best way for this to happen would be if somebody just said, "Hey, I think I'm qualified. I'd like to be considered to do this role to serve the Lord here." The problem with that in our culture is if a guy did that, he would be viewed as wanting to grasp control and not be allowed to be an elder most of the time. And yet, I think that would probably be the more spirit of what the scriptures really is trying to teach us to do, which is what's really ironic about that. But yeah, I would agree with you that if somebody doesn't have a desire, in fact, I would probably say out of all these things we talk about in Titus 1 and First Timothy chapter 3, probably the thing to say is I like the way you said that. That's the only disqualification in those texts. The rest of the things we're going to talk about are intended to be I don't even like the terms qualifications, really. I like more the idea of characteristics of a man. and we'll talk about
Mhm.
that. But I do think that's a disqualification. By the way, one of the things I want to say on the outset is it's one of those subjects that there's a good chance that you and I aren't going to agree with everything. And what I mean by that is not probably ultimately where we get. I think we agree with that. We may just disagree on how to express some things in regards to this discussion. We may say things in different ways, and that's okay. And I think that's one of the things to come from these conversations is to understand that it's okay to differ slightly in those things. Um, and I think somewhat to be expected, by the way. I personally, and I think you would agree with this, I'd be scared if you and I agreed on every single thing uh, for a lot
Not
of
gonna happen.
reasons. Yeah, it's not going to happen. And but yet, I still think, obviously, everybody knows not only we're friends, we're in fellowship with each other, we're in fellowship as brethren, and so that's one of the things that's great from this whole work that we're doing together is to show that it's okay to differ on some of these things. They're not fellowship breaking ideas in that sense. So with that said, let's get into the discussion of the characteristics. And one of the things I'll just start off with, obviously we're talking about today specifically the passages in Titus 1, 1 Timothy chapter 3. And one of the things I just want to comment on the outset is that, and the reason I don't like these as qualifications is because when I think about qualifications, like I think of job requirements. So I think of a checklist in that sense, Phil, that if I have a job requirement that requires a high school diploma, that's an easy decision for me to make. I can look at that qualification and I can determine pretty quickly, factually, whether or not you've graduated high school and have a legitimate diploma. Um, Most of these things in these two texts, you can't quantify that way. And I think that's contributed to the mishandling of these two passages. And I would prefer to describe these two things as, or the way we view these are, I'm going to say it this way, and maybe that would generate more discussion between the two of us. These are subjective judgments that people have to make, which makes us very uncomfortable. I think we're supposed to take these things listed in these texts and take a man and make a subjective judgment. So, in other words, if it's be hospitable, the characteristic of hospitality, I think the way we try to make that a qualification is we personalize that and go, well, I've never been in that person's house, therefore he's not hospitable. Whereas really what it should be is more of a subjective judgment. Hey, I may have never been in this person's house, but I've seen other people that have, and I've seen a spirit of him doing things. I think he's hospitable. That's two different approaches to that. One is this idea of trying to come up with a definite factual qualification, where the other is more a subjective judgment that's making about that person in that sense. And I think that's how we should approach these lists more than this trying to check a list off of factual qualifications in that idea.
Right. And I'll break these things out. There are some of the expectations, qualifications, characteristics that really are cut and dry. That we quickly move off the list. Gender, marital relations, etc. Family man. That means he actually has a family. In those senses are like, yeah, those are ABs. Like you either are or you aren't. And the world
Sure.
does not hinge on your relationship to God because of those things. It just says, have you had the chance to build the skills to shepherd in those environments? And I think it's an important thing that we're looking at is that we're going to talk about the work of an elder in the future in more detail. And I want to call back to something. We had a great conversation with Max Dawson earlier where he talks about his perspective on the work. Go back and watch that video in preparation for some of our future conversations in this area that are diving a little bit deeper into the details. But some of those qualifications or characteristics certainly are AB, easy to acknowledge from the outside. But like Terry, I'll say that some of these criteria are going to require you to trust what you can see and may never be able to verify because of the interaction that you are allowed into a person's life. The closer you are to a person, the more likely you're able to give a better perspective of the how accomplished side of things, like the output of children. There are men that I know that have fabulous children that they have, brought into this world, but those children are fabulous independent of the input of the father. Um, and so just because dad was at home providing the financial means for the home didn't mean he provided the spiritual means for the home.
Right.
And so we've got to use our judgment then to evaluate those things, just as much as we use judgment in the understanding of, say, Titus 1:7, must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, drunkard, violent, or greedy for gain. There's an opportunity for us to use some good godly discipline to say, all right, where is this in the thing? Because no matter a person starts, they're going to continue to improve in those areas as they mature in Christ, you would assume. They're not going to reach a static point. And so you're not
Yeah.
looking for perfection, you're looking for present tense capacity, if you will.
Yeah, and
Um,
even in those, by the way, those A/B things. What's interesting about the A/B things that you talk about, which is true, they then have a layer of subjectivity that follows up with that. So, yeah, is he married? That's an A/B decision. But the subjective follow up is okay. So he's married, but is he a good husband? Because that's where that comes to play. Is so again, does he have a family? Does he have kids? Okay, that's an A/B decision. The the follow up to that becomes subjective is what kind of father is he? Because in regards to this idea of character of an elder, that's truly where we decide whether or not a man is qualified to use that term or has the character of an elder is not if he has kids or how many kids he has or even how many of them have been baptized, but rather what was his role like within the home and how did he influence that family to do the right things. And that's what always brings us back to a subjective decision. And the reason why that's so important, I will say, is at least in my lifetime, I remember early on as a kid and even early on in churches that I worked with that didn't have elders, that we kind of boiled the eldership qualification process down. We never said this, but it really became about two qualifications because it was objective. It became about how many kids he has, if there's more than one, and are they all baptized believers, and how many times has he been married. And as long as I could count those things and I could make this A/B objective decision, then a man became an elder in a lot of places. Or what really happened in that field was men weren't made elders. Let me say it that way. Those were more often used as ways not to allow men to be elders. And I think in the process of that, I think that contributed to not having more elders in the churches then and even now in that process. Because we made it so objective that we didn't have to be personal and subjective in our judgments of one another.
yeah, I think I would say agree on a really meta level, an overall level, that we have used a couple of key comments in Timothy and Titus as our qualifiers, and then we use everything else as a future disqualifier.
Yeah.
In that we look at some of the things, lover of good, self-controlled, holy, disciplined, his ability to stay firm to the trustworthy word as our future disqualifiers. That, well, if this behavior comes up, then he's no good, and we made a mistake, and he's no longer an elder or a shepherd, rather than pausing, reflecting, and considering the totality of those things, realizing our limitation. We can only really examine a few of them on the personal level, and learning to trust the people involved in the process, which is a side discussion that we may be able to have in the future about how elders can be appointed and who has a hand on the throttle, if you will, which is a separate, longer discussion, maybe even that we're going to talk about right now. So if we go down through these criteria, the qualifications, the ideas, the character traits, because of the medium we're using, we're not going to be heavily able to do some illustrative textual breakouts like we might use in other contexts. But let's take some of the hot button ones to start with, because why not? You know, so in the terms that are used in regards to the relationship, one of the issues that comes up, and I think we can deal with quickly, is the marital status question.
Yeah.
What's going on with those terms? You generally end up with about 2 or 3 views that people have in regards to the understanding. Oh, I got a little feedback there of this passage. And so view number 1, that he's a one-woman man. That when he is married to one woman. You have another view that says he can only have been married one time, and that must be continuous. You have some who kind of mix those things together in different ways, but they all tend to come back to that same concept of, in a world that had the potential for polygamy, what Paul is telling Timothy and Titus is that you want a monogamous man. And I think there's some value in exploring that from a starting point. So Terry, what's been your experience there with that particular clause in the text?
Well, one of the things I found interesting about the way this text is used in regards to marriage is just the inconsistency of it, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier of trying to make this A-B decision. I've always found it interesting that the people who believe that it meant that he could only be married once also typically believe that if he's a widower, he cannot continue to serve, which is very inconsistent, by the way. I have always viewed this as, I think it was H.E. Phillips in his book that said that essentially what Paul is saying is he couldn't be a bachelor and he couldn't be a polygamist, or what you described as a one-woman man. And I typically have come to that conclusion. I've told people before, I can't be in fellowship with a man that has 2 wives. And while that seems oversimplistic, that's just my understanding. And I think that's really what this is talking about. Now, I think the subjective level of that, by the way, is this concept of what I said earlier. It's not just about how many times it's been married, but what kind of husband he is. Look, if this guy has only been married once, but everybody knows he's had 18 affairs and his wife is a saint, then obviously he's not qualified. And just because he's been married once and he's a one-woman man in that sense, he's not monogamous, though, which is a judgment call on that idea. And so that's kind of where my understanding comes. So when somebody wants to automatically say, well, if he's divorced and remarried, obviously he's at fault for something. While that could be true, that's not always true. And if he is scripturally divorced and remarried, my understanding is he's still a one-woman man in the eyes of God. Now, not everybody agrees with that. And again, I understand that. I think this is probably the time we should say this to clarify. Just because an elder could serve at Chelsea where I'm at does not mean he could serve at Eastside where you're at, Phil. That there's a level of autonomy in this that has to be respected as well. In whether a man can shepherd within that congregation. And so all of that applies here. Look, I understand somebody might see a guy, and because of even though he's married to one person, they might determine he just can't serve. I'm respectful of that. But I'd be more respectful of that if that was a judgment based on other things than just the number of times he's married. I think to just count the number of marriages and make a definitive decision without any kind of tie to the man's character, which I think is what's at play here, fails to treat the text properly, is what I would say to all of that. I rambled on, so you can clean that up.
All right, so you got a couple things that are interacting the thing. We've got a textual question of what the words mean. We've got an application side of things, and so to get things out of order, my application personally, from my understanding of the text, comes back to a perception of someone who is presently married with a scriptural right to be married to one person.
Correct.
And that's my application side. To get there, the wordings in both in these key passages, but also through the general use of the New Testament, provide that same inclusive perspective. And this kind of ties together to a question we got from Tommy Sluss. What are the implications when defining these characteristics as subjective of considering 100 different members' subjective opinions over a man's life? I'll say this from one edge of that. That's par for the course in the process. If someone is being put forward to serve as an elder, you are going to get subjective opinions over a man's life no matter what you do.
Yeah, that's happening anyway. That's already happening. Yeah.
And many of the times that comes up, they will admit in those conversations that this is their opinion and they're not holding it as a standard for everybody else, and you're going to just have to talk it out. And so that's just part of the process. It's not an easy thing for anybody involved. I'll say this, even for those who are concerned, have what they felt is a heartfelt objection, and they bring it to the man or to whoever is aiding in that process of conversation, that's really hard for that edge of that person to be open to that. And so the implication is that it's going to slow the process down. You're going to be more realistic with the text, at least in my judgment. You're going to have to then allow for differences in conclusion, but then support in appointment. That you're going to be okay. Like, hey, maybe this guy isn't ready just yet. That's maybe my judgment. But 50, 60 other members are looking at me and saying, we've known him for 30 years. He's ready. And I'll say that as an evangelist, we do that all the time. If I go hold a meeting somewhere and they have shepherds in place, I don't question their qualifications. I go, I preach, I expect their support, they expect mine. If I go move somewhere to work with a congregation that already has elders, I'll talk about these issues. But if I decide to go work with them, they become my shepherds day one, just like a family that moved into the community and joined the group. And we trust the group's consensus before we got there. Those are normal things that happen already. And I think those are included in part in the text.
Let me add to that, to Tommy's question. So subjective judgments opinions are already happening. What I'm calling for is not so much subjective opinions, but more subjective judgments based on these actual characteristics. Yeah. And if we teach people how to have proper scriptural subjective judgments on these characteristics, we get a much more pure process than what normally happens is we just tell people subjective opinions don't matter, and yet they make them anyway, and that always rears its ugly head. So the subjective judgments have to be within the confines of these characteristics that are listed. And if you're going to make I think where that makes sense is you got 100 members and you've got 3 members that don't want a guy to be an elder. That's always going to be a subjective judgment on their part. But now the requirement is show me how that subjective judgment fits into these characteristics and why that is something worthy of consideration, rather than what has happened in the past, treating it objectively. This person has a subjective opinion. They're not applying it to the characteristics, but they're going to carry that baggage for the next 15 years, and every time there's a problem, they're going to talk about it. We make that a part of the process, and we talk about it on the outset. We deal with that in a much more appropriate and I believe scriptural way from that standpoint.
Let me add this. Using the terminology subjective does not mean lacking standard.
Correct.
And I think that's sometimes an important clarification to make. You can be subjective with a very clear and understandable standard, making that subjective judgment. So like Terry, who makes the best queso that you've had at a restaurant?
Wow.
See?
I can't even tell you. But I mean, yeah.
See, so there's you have standards, right?
Right.
We're pulling standards into play. We're talking freshness. We're talking, flavors. We're talking location, all that stuff. So, but that's the whole point. That we have a standard. It's not merely just an uneducated opinion. It's a legitimate standard that we're appealing to.
And some of these are purely subjective. I mean, there's no way around some of this. So if you were to say, is Phil sober-minded? There's no objective way to qualify that. That is 100% a subjective judgment that I have to make about Phil based on our relationship and my knowledge and where he's at in life. And so
Right.
I think that's one of the things.
You're making a subjective judgment on the basis of an objective standard. The standard is really defined. We're asking how close to that standard does the person get, and am I satisfied as a sheep to follow the shepherd with the group of leaders that we then look to? We're kind of overly complicating something at times, but we need to understand it well. So going back to our first text we looked at, a lot of times people are getting amped up about something that really isn't an issue for the most part. For the most part, the marital status of a man serving as a shepherd really is a tangential issue because it gets dealt with before it even gets that far along. If a guy is a polygamist, you deal with that early in conversion.
Right.
If his marriage is breaking up, you should be shepherding that man in advance of this so that his marriage is restored because you care about him, not because you want him to be an elder one day.
Correct.
So let's go ahead and move to the next hot button text. This one is probably more common of an issue than the first one. And we'll get back to being above reproach toward the end. And by the way, I'm using right now just the text of Titus as a guideline for the conversation as opposed to the text in Timothy. But there's some interactions that will come up. So the text, verse 6 continues, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. This text in particular, as Terry's mentioned before, tends to be the mathematical litmus test. And there are 3 or 4 common considerations that are brought up in response to it. We look at it, we say, okay, we got to make a distinction. How are we going to start sorting the people down to a smaller number because we can't consider every man? And so we ask, are his children Christians? That's and I'll tell you, even though that my particular look at the text there really lends itself to say, yeah, that's kind of what they're getting at because of the corollary negative in the text of Titus. I think that's a bad approach to sort it down only by that criteria. I think it's not a good textual approach. It doesn't do justice to the scriptures. It puts a lot of pressure on the kids of elders that's unnecessary and unwise. That being all said, that doesn't mean that that's something you don't pay attention to. But I think it's a really bad process or hermeneutic to say, all right, there we go. He's married. He's present at services. He's taught a Bible class before, and his kids have been to the water to be baptized. So he's an elder.
So let me throw the monkey wrench in that approach that's beyond that. And this is where, like I said in our for those who don't know, our pre-broadcast discussion. When I read Timothy and Titus, I don't combine them as one master list because I don't have any reason to think they shared lists. So I have to read them independently and figure out how did the same guy get appointed by both lists. Where that becomes really difficult in regards to household management or children is that Timothy's list, if you were to read it without ever reading Titus's, you would not get close to the idea from the language there that every child was a baptized believer. And, I think one of the things that we struggle with is how to harmonize these two passages. We treat them a lot like we do with salvation, which is we take all the different things and we stack them together into one long stack. And I don't think we can do that because we don't have any idea that was ever done. So now, before anybody thinks I'm a heretic, and I don't think that's important.
Oh, you're a heretic.
That's where subjective judgment comes into play. Would I think that a guy's managed his house well and is able to teach based on what Timothy says if none of his kids or Christians have ever been faithful Obviously, no. And so ultimately, we're going to get to the same conclusion, but without damaging the text in the way that I think we've damaged the text before, in trying to force something in there in a way that just doesn't need to be forced. And the reason I say that is, here's what Timothy says. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. Now, the reason why I say we would never, ever interpret that the same way we do if we didn't have Timothy is because that is almost a mirrored reflection of what the deacon's qualification is in regards to his family. And we don't interpret that to mean all Christians are baptized, because there's no other sister text that says a deacon's kids should be believers, faithful, pistos, to use that Greek word. Didn't want to think that's how I pronounce it. I'm not a scholar in language, have done enough on this to be slightly dangerous. So from that standpoint, I think that's when we have to kind of understand how we've abused this text in the past with this kind of objective numerical A/B judgment. And I think there's a much clearer, better way. One of the problems with that, by the way, is this. What if a man's children are all baptized believers, but everybody knows he had nothing to do with that? Is he qualified to serve? Because has he really proven that he's managed his household well in that regard, if you want to make it mean that, if he had nothing to do with that? Very real life example of that. A man who you meet and you don't know his background, in his late 60s, all of his children are faithful Christians. You would think he is qualified to be an elder until you find out that he was baptized in his 50s after all of his children have left home and they were faithful at the time. Now he is no longer qualified in that sense. That's a subjective judgment, because he didn't have any play in that sense. He didn't have any part in that, if that's the way you're going to define that qualification. So that's why we have to be careful in that sense, I think.
Careful reading the text for me would be really simple. If he was not involved in the raising of his home and the leadership of his home, he's not qualified.
Correct.
He's not building the skills. And so it gets answered in another part of the criteria stream anyway, no matter
but
how
that is
you're
a
going to look at that
subjective
particular.
judgment is the point. That's a
Well,
subjective.
you're still going to be looking at the objective standard and making a very concise subjective look at it and say, now what?
Correct.
Because in the end, and this kind of gets to the above reproach comment that I kind of punted to the end. In the end, what you're doing is looking at the work and looking at the man and asking a very simple question. And it's two edges. Is he capable of leading, and will the flock follow him?
Correct.
Because that's all that really, on the practical end, you're using God's winnowing fork to figure out who that is. But that's the practical side of it. Do they have the qualities necessary, and will the flock follow? And that's why you get to these subjective ranges of this guy might be qualified here, but not there. And that's perfectly fine. It's appropriate.
Right.
The shepherd should know the flock to a certain level. Day one, you pick your favorite shepherd you've known over the years. They move because of whatever reason and they start worshiping somewhere else. They're not qualified yet. But they very well may be in a very short period of time, based on how open they are to interacting with the families there and getting to know them and et cetera. It's a challenging task to go through that process of blending into a group in that regard. So I hope we help kind of partially answered Tommy's question, because they're interrelated in many ways.
And let me say that above reproach idea, that's kind of, I think, the litmus test in the idea of subjective judgments. That's how I personally view this. Is this man above reproach? So, like, the question always comes up about adult children, right? If your children are faithful, and then let's say, Phil, you're serving as a shepherd now. Let's say that continues 20 years down the road. We hope this never happens. One of your kids becomes unfaithful. Does that automatically unqualify you because of what they did as an adult child? there's all this wrangling about like, well, they're not in the household. That doesn't mean that anymore. The qualification, that's an A/B decision. Where I think
Right.
that my personal judgment goes into would be this. It would be this reasoning: is Phil's response to his child's unfaithfulness above reproach? If your response was to condone their unfaithfulness, you're no longer above reproach in that area of your life. And I would think that would make you lack the characteristics to serve in that capacity. But if your
Right.
response was above reproach to your child, you did not condone it, and you even went to the extent of changing your relationship to try to influence a change in their life, you're above reproach. And that's really what we're talking about in all of these areas. And I think when it comes to kids, I think that's really the bigger question. There's this A/B side that we want to get into, but the bigger question is this guy above reproach in regards to how his kids turned out and how they're currently behaving? Or
And that's
is
always
he
going to
not?
be a tough thing to evaluate. And I'll say this, and again, if you're looking for language study level discussions, that's another context. It's really tough to do that in this medium, especially with unequal footing, because you may bring those who are watching might bring a deeper level of knowledge of the languages than Terry and I possess, or you might want to go down different tangents. I'll say this
Right.
though, if you want direction on where to get a deeper look into some of these textual interactions. And I'll give this quick illustration of that. I can point you in all the different corners you want to go. The Net Bible, which is a really interesting interactive translation of the text, does this with this passage in particular in the correlation of Titus and Timothy. They'll note that their whole rationale for a variant translation in Titus is due to the interaction of the text. They kind of look at First Timothy and say we need to approach Titus because of First Timothy. But the fairness can be that you can approach Timothy with the perspective of Titus and end up at the same rationale but different conclusions because of the terminologies that are used there. And because this textual tension in the text is not an easy one to answer. And I say textual tension in the sense of how do we translate these words in a sensible way from a first century language into a 21st century conversation. Translation is a whole nother bag, well out of the scope of what we want to accomplish here, but it's important. And that's why sometimes preachers might preach an entire sermon or have an entire Bible class on how to handle some of these complicated interactions, because it is a challenge to do so. There's a reason why not everybody is a textual translator. It's a difficult task. And anyway, we jumped down that hole a little too deep there. So going back to the text of Titus, the text of First Timothy, and these interactions and how these things are going to play out, you'll notice as you go from the list, it goes from home level interaction, keeper at home concept, husband of one wife, children of believers, not open to the charge of debauchery and subordination. By the way, those two terms that are used there both interact with believers or trustworthy in specific ways, either moral rebellion or leadership rebellion in Titus. And then he goes on and talks about this repetition of being above reproach, and it goes to a public view. Arrogant, quick-tempered, drunkard, violent, greedy for gain, hospitable, lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. These are things that are much more visible in the day-to-day life of a person than you're going to see in how did he participate in the raising of his children. And again, you're still going to be making these same subjective questions about objective issues and saying, what do I see? Can I trust that? You could flip it another level and say, when I grow up spiritually, do I want to be like he is now? Because you always rise to the maturity of the leadership you choose to surround yourself with. And so that's kind of what you're doing when you're looking at shepherds. So I want to rise to that level.
Yeah, and I
And they
think I think to add to that, um, one thing we've not talked about, there needs to be also a level of mercy in some of this as well, Phil. And what I mean by that is, so the whole above reproach, you've probably heard people say, well, 20 years ago he did X,
Hmm.
and that means he's not qualified now. Um, Judge a man where he's at, and see whether or not he's changed from 20 years ago, rather than, especially if you're the person that he offended 20 years ago, which is the most common, by the way that is approached. So when you think about those different terms that are more public, you need to think of them from a very public, not personal, not as personal kind of idea, I think, in that sense. And I always, again, I go back to the same thing I said about kids. So when I look at that list and I ask the questions, that he is not quick tempered. Okay. So is he above reproach in that? He's not violent man. Is he above reproach in that? And that's just the way I approach all of that, as kind of my litmus test of being able to make this subjective judgment, is where is his character? And I think part of that is what you said. Do I want to be like this guy? Which, by the way, gets more into probably what we'll talk about in the future of the work. I mean, part of his work is an example. He's a shepherd's supposed to be this role model for me, for my kids. So as I'm considering those characteristics, I have to consider within the context of, this is the guy we do put up kind of, hate to say on a pedestal, but as an example to the flock of, this is what I want to be like. This is the
Right.
kind of character worth imitating.
Are you still there?
I'm there. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Just all of a sudden, it sounded like you were still had more of your sentence. I'm like, uh-oh.
No, 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 no. Go ahead.
Um, so I think that's a facet there that has to be considered, especially as you're trying to see how those characteristics interweave into your understanding of the person. From a preaching standpoint, you're also trying to convey that to the congregation, that this is what you're looking for. You're not looking for perfection. You're looking for an illustration of the work. That this is someone who is engaged, who is considering God's expectation. They're living it out in a practical way, and that you will be not only willing to interact with them, but you want to interact with them, that you desire that kind of relationship. And um, those are challenging sections when you have those tension moments of, in the past, he did such and such, but I also know he made it right. And then I also know he went the extra mile to take correction to practicality, um, which is an important kind of stepping stone in the procedure. Beyond that, you go back to the text again and really kind of leaning into it. We've got a few more that I want to spend a little bit of time on because we've already got 44 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I want to identify hospitality and the aptitude to teach, or a firm understanding to instruct in sound doctrine. We'll start with hospitality. I want to tell you, it does not mean that he has potlucks at his house, nor does it simply mean that he is open to having strangers come and spend the night at his home. It is a more inclusive term that would certainly include both of those things. But in the way that the term is used, you're really looking for someone who is welcoming to the stranger and to the well-known. That if someone came into your assembly, they're going to be willing to stop their private conversation, go over and sit down next to the person who is already doing the awkward thing of coming to a church for the first time, and make them feel welcome. Um, a lover of strangers is really kind of the literal side of what you see there as the word that's translated hospitality or hospitable here, but the practical side is going to be proactive. They're going to go and do.
Yeah.
They're going to show you how to go and do. I know you
Yeah.
talked before about one of the things that you did and have continued to try to do with young people is encourage them to be inclusive to young people when they visit.
Right.
A visitor comes, they've got a young family, they got some teenagers. One of your teenagers should be going to them and inviting them to sit with them. Well, where do they learn that? Well, they're not going to always listen to dad telling them to do that. But if they see a shepherd do that, they'll model that behavior. And that's kind of what you're looking at least when I see that text.
Yeah, and in the area of personal judgment, so let me illustrate it this way. You may see an elder who has people in his home all the time, at least from the outset. But then after further investigation, you realize it's the same four families all the time. It's his group of friends. He is not fulfilling the role of being hospitable in the sense of what this text is saying.
Yep.
So, and that's the key is it's not just a test of, oh, he has people over. Hospitable here, like you said, is how he approaches strangers. So when I have somebody who looks at a certain group of people that come into the assembly and their question to me is, where did those people come from and why are they here? That would tell me they're not hospitable in that sense. So again, that's where understanding what we're talking about and a judgment goes into play in that kind of discussion. And that's where we get into this, what I've called all along is the subjective judgment. And part of that's based on the understanding of what the text is saying in that term. So like you said, where does the church learn to be inclusive of strangers? Should be from their shepherds who show. If somebody walks in that's not a member, they stop the conversation they're at and they include that person in some way. They connect. That's what the spirit of this text is talking about.
So our last one then, for at least for today, is to talk about teaching capacity. I think sometimes we use some unequal standards in evaluating this area. We'll ask questions, has he ever taught a class before, or has he ever preached a sermon before? Those things do not necessarily equate to aptitude or ability to accomplish the goal. And I know that's the case in a very simple way because there are some individuals who have all the zeal and desire to preach, but they're not effective in it. And that effectiveness isn't a permanent condition of they can't and never will. It's that they're developing in that area. Secondly, if you only limit it to the public displays of teaching, I guarantee you're not having a good holistic look at it because it doesn't tell us that. It doesn't say you've got to preach a sermon or you have to teach a big adult level Bible class. That's not what the text says. It's that you've demonstrated the ability to teach with this as a goal. And the goal that you see in the text there is correcting spiritual behavior. And that could take place publicly or privately. And again, it's a subjective thing, like how effective they are, because you can't judge the other end of the equation. The person didn't change their mind. Okay, he's a bad teacher. That's not true. It could be the best teacher because that was Jesus. And some people don't change their minds. So you're asking, do I see ability there, capability demonstrated?
Well, and it's interesting because an eldership's teaching is going to be done both publicly and privately. I've been associated with elderships in my years of preaching where I know of one eldership that one of the men had never taught a public Bible class. That was not what he did. But he was a very, very effective teacher privately. And in fact, when it came to private instruction as a shepherd and correcting people privately, he excelled beyond any of the other shepherds who had taught publicly. And it showed some wisdom within that congregation to understand that he was able to teach, just not in the traditional behind the lectern way that we often interpret it. And one of the things to understand is you need both of those, by the way. That church would have suffered had they not had him as a private instructor, as a shepherd. They would have been worse off if they had not seen that.
Absolutely.
And that's one of those things that I think we just don't understand fully sometimes. And I think that's something to consider as you move forward with that ability. It could be exerted in a lot of different ways. He was never going to get in the pulpit and teach a lesson, but he was the first one to go to somebody's house when they were unfaithful and get them to come back. And wow, that's shepherding,
Yeah, and that kind of lends into our next conversation, which is the work of elders as we go forward. A couple caveats. We realize that we didn't cover every single qualification because that wasn't our goal. Time would not allow us to sit down and say each of these characteristics, let's break down the word, let's break down the terms, let's talk about the textual interactions. But I do think you can kind of see the need to reevaluate the process by which you look at these things, particularly from you're going to preach and teach on it. You need to preach in an inclusive way that the characteristics lead to the work. Regardless of whether you agree with Terry or I on the application side of these verses, if you're not teaching in a way that these characteristics lead to the work of an elder, you're going to be only doing about half of the job. And a half-done job is a job not done at all. And so I think he might agree with me, at least on that point, that that's really something we've got to be leading to, is a deep understanding of that interaction. Terry?
Two things. First off, I think the really key to this is we need to do a lot of teaching and training on how to view these characteristics and how to properly evaluate a man in a way that's scriptural, that's merciful, but also, let me say it this way, and we've said this before, that lends itself to the church having elders rather than lends itself to preventing men from ever serving. And I think that's a responsibility of preachers to do that. Second thing, and much less important, you mentioned earlier the Net Bible, and I put a link up to Amazon. There's a new edition that came out of that with full notes, 1st of October. That is the best purchase I have made personally in years, and I highly recommend that you spend the $34 to get that. And whenever you're looking at a text, it is really helpful to have that as a resource. So I highly advise that. And for those of you that don't use books, there is something about holding that physical book that I think it is even better than being on your screen. So if you're interested in that, I'd advise you to go look at that. It is a price cut right now, so it makes it pretty affordable, I think, at this point, which is, like I said, it's just a little over $33.
Right, and it's cheaper on Logos if you're a Logos user and you just want the access to it as a side note, and it's free on the internet. And so you're paying for the binding of it, which is certainly worth it, especially if you want to have access to it when you don't have access to the digital environments. So, and it's a good tool. It probably can shortcut some quick questions. No substitute for study, no substitute for a deep understanding of the languages, but it does explain why they translated a text the way that they did. And so that's probably the best value of it, is that, like, why did they use this word here? It will get you over the hump of going to Strong's Concordance and saying, well, Strong says it means this, so the text must mean that. It's much more holistic, inclusive from a study tool. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's very insightful. I mean, it really is, because they also take cultural implications into the context that you probably wouldn't have included had you not seen that. So I think it's very helpful in that sense.
Yeah, and you can think about it this way, and this is a kind of a tie-in closeout. You can study a language, but you may not have a conversation until a few years down the road. Maybe you travel somewhere and you realize that your study of a language was academic, your conversation is practical. The Net Bible tries to kind of stay in the middle, where it's academic, but it's trying to teach you to have a conversation. And that's a shift in understanding and maturity that they're trying to accomplish with that work. And it's very good. Mm-hmm. Going forward, next week, we hope to talk about the work of shepherds, unless something changes. We do also have some other topics on the table of things that we'll look at. Beyond that, in the future as well, we're going to have some more guests. And if you've got questions, things that you want us to talk about, I know we have a couple that we've received already that we're going to try to include that were sent to us. We're going to continue to break those out. Please do that. And if we can help you in your work, let us know. We're happy to serve in the ways that we can. Terry, you get the last words.
I'm looking forward to the hour-and-a-half long broadcast that is your slideshow from your trip to the Holy Lands. That's my favorite thing's coming up. I say that in jest because I will not allow you to do that.
It's
Um,
okay. If folks want to do that, we're actually going to do that, some lessons from the lands here in Sharpsburg. So you just get in your car and drive over. But I don't think there'll be a live stream for you to annoy us with. Um,
in all honesty and seriousness, thanks for joining us today. Um, Phil and I are both passionate about this. I think one of the things we think of is that churches need elders, and we want to help churches and evangelists and even future elders understand that and implement that as God intended it. So we hope these discussions are helpful in that sense and look forward to future discussions.